You've seen it. That moment in a period drama when an actress walks into a Renaissance ballroom and something feels off. Her face is too symmetrical. Her teeth are too perfect. She looks like she's seen an iPhone. And here's the thing, she has. But it's more than the teeth, more than the symmetry. Watch her eyes. Watch how she holds her face. There's a quality to modern actresses that doesn't match the portraits hanging on those fictional castle walls. We've been conditioned by a century of film close-ups, by Instagram selfies, by constant exposure to our own faces in front-facing cameras. Our expressions carry that knowledge. Our faces move differently because we've spent our lives being photographed. People in those original portraits had that same uncanny quality to their contemporaries, and everyone knew why. There's an anecdote that floats through historical discussions in dozens of versions. Some German prince, supposedly, received a portrait of his prospective bride and remarked that he understood perfectly well how court painters operated. The story gets attached to different princes, different brides, different centuries. No primary source confirms it. It's become historical folklore. A story that survives because it captures something true about how people actually engaged with portraits. But did people actually fall for these flattering portraits? Or were they in on the joke the entire time? There's a case so thoroughly documented with so many surviving letters and dispatches and personal accounts that we can reconstruct exactly what happened. And it tells us everything about whether historical people were naive or sophisticated about their visual media. The answer is, they weren't fooled. They were just as savvy as you are. But first, why do we find certain faces appealing in the first place? Why did Renaissance painters exaggerate the specific features they did? And why do modern actresses, even in period costumes with period hairstyles, still look somehow contemporary? The answer connects evolutionary biology, art theory, and the way visual media shapes our perception of what's normal. In 1584, a Milanese painter named Giovanni Paolo Lamazzo published his massive Trattato dell'arte della pittura. It's essentially a manual for artists, running to hundreds of pages, and Lamazzo devoted substantial attention to what makes portraits pleasing. He recommended enlarging the eyes and forehead while reducing anything that suggested coarseness. This wasn't presented as trickery. It was the proper business of art, elevating nature toward its ideal form. Why eyes specifically? Because large eyes trigger something in us. We find them endearing, sympathetic, trustworthy. Scientists now call this neoteny, the retention of juvenile features that activate protective and nurturing responses in adult viewers. Think about why we find puppies adorable. Why baby animals make us go soft. It's the big eyes relative to the face, the round head, the soft features. These proportions signal youth, vulnerability, a need for care. Lamazzo didn't have that terminology, but he understood the effect practically. Painters had observed for generations that subjects with larger eyes appeared more sympathetic and appealing, so they painted the eyes bigger. Not dramatically, just enough to shift the balance. Just enough to make viewers feel warmth toward the subject rather than neutrality. Federico Zuccaro, writing to a fellow painter in 1574, put it explicitly. The eyes should be rendered somewhat larger than life to capture the sitter's inner light. Not a secret practice. Professional knowledge shared openly between artists. They knew they were manipulating perception. They discussed it in letters. They wrote it in treatises. Modern beauty standards tap into the same biological wiring, but express it differently. We still respond to neotenic features. That hasn't changed in 400 years. What's changed is which specific enhancements our culture has normalized. And then there's the forehead. Medieval and Renaissance noblewomen plucked, shaved, and chemically removed their hairlines, sometimes pushing them back several inches. The Italian physician Giovanni Marinello documented the preparations they used in his 1562 treatise Gli ornamenti delle donne. He described mixtures of quicklime and arsenic applied specifically to achieve that high forehead look. Why would anyone do this? The connection between forehead height and intelligence was codified in physiognomic texts that circulated widely among educated readers. A low hairline suggested animal passions, base instincts, and inability to control urges. A high forehead meant noble reasoning, intellectual capacity, spiritual refinement. Whether or not this was scientifically valid, it wasn't. It was culturally powerful. Women manipulated their hairlines to signal membership in the refined class. Here's what matters. This manipulation was conducted in plain sight. Servants assisted their mistresses with the plucking. Visitors could watch it happen. Marinello's treatise was printed and sold openly to anyone who could afford it. When painters depicted women with fashionably high foreheads, they were documenting an alteration everyone already knew about. The portrait recorded the performance of beauty, not its natural occurrence. No one was confused about this. Which brings us to January 1540 and Henry VIII, and the most thoroughly documented portrait-related disaster in early modern European history. Hans Holbein the Younger had been working as the king's painter since 1536, earning £30 annually, a substantial salary reflecting his extraordinary technical skill and his unusual reputation. Here's the crucial detail. Contemporary sources distinguish Holbein from typical court painters, precisely because of his relative truthfulness. That distinction would be meaningless if all painters were assumed to pursue accuracy. It's like saying someone is unusually honest. The phrase only makes sense if honesty isn't the default. When Henry needed to evaluate potential brides at a distance, Holbein was the obvious choice. Not because portraits were generally reliable, because his portraits were considered more reliable than others. Think about what that implies about every other portrait. The diplomatic mission went to Cleves in summer 1539. Thomas Cromwell, who had arranged the potential match, sent Holbein to paint both Anne and her sister Amelia, so Henry could choose between them. Cromwell's instructions, preserved in state papers, emphasized that Holbein should capture the women's likenesses faithfully. Stop there. Consider that instruction carefully. If portraits were routinely accurate, why would you need to specify this? Cromwell felt he had to explicitly say, paint them accurately, because accurate wasn't the default setting. The instruction itself is evidence of portrait skepticism. Everyone involved knew that flattering portraits were the norm, and Cromwell wanted something different. The English ambassadors Christopher Mont and Thomas Wotton accompanied Holbein. In letters dated August 1539, Wotton reported that the portraits were very lively representations, the standard terminology for praising likeness. The ambassadors had seen both the women and the paintings. They judged them accurate by the standards of their time. Henry received Holbein's painting of Anne. He agreed to the match, and then he met her. New Year's Day, 1540, Rochester. The king arrived to surprise his bride-to-be, apparently expecting to find the woman he'd imagined from the portrait. The French ambassador Charles de Marillac reported to Francis I that Henry was deeply disappointed. Cromwell's own notes record the king's complaint. She is nothing so fair as she hath been reported. Henry reportedly said to Cromwell directly, I like her not. The traditional interpretation frames this as evidence of portrait deception. Holbein lied. Henry was fooled. The portrait was a 16th century catfish. But look at the evidence more carefully. Holbein had been specifically selected for his accuracy. The ambassadors confirmed the portrait's fidelity. No one involved believed Holbein had distorted Anne's appearance in the manner of typical court flattery. The portrait was, by all contemporary accounts, a good likeness. So what actually happened? Something subtler, something more familiar. Even a relatively accurate portrait could not convey the 1,000 small factors, voice, movement, presence, chemistry, that determine attraction between human beings. Henry knew this intellectually. He'd been married 3 times before. He'd commissioned portraits. He'd sat for portraits. He understood how the whole system worked, understood its limitations. He'd simply hoped, against his own knowledge, that the usual gap between portrait and person wouldn't matter this time. Sound familiar? It should. It's exactly what happens when you meet someone whose dating profile was technically accurate, but somehow different from what you'd constructed in your imagination. The photos weren't lies. They showed the real person. But reality failed to spark the hoped-for connection because you'd filled in the gaps with your own projections. Henry filled in the gaps, too. He imagined Anne's voice, her laugh, the way she'd move through a room. None of that was in the portrait. None of that could be. The aftermath confirms nobody blamed Holbein for deception. The painter retained his position at court, continued receiving his salary, remained in royal favor until his death from plague in 1543. If Henry had believed Holbein deceived him, the painter would have been ruined, or worse. Henry wasn't known for tolerating people who made him look foolish. Thomas Cromwell was eventually executed in July 1540, but the charges were political and religious, heresy and treason related to his support of religious reform. The Anne of Cleves marriage was mentioned among his failures, but the failure was diplomatic and personal, not artistic, not a matter of portrait fraud. Henry's own behavior reveals his sophisticated understanding of visual representation. He complained bitterly about the discrepancy between portrait and person, but he never claimed the portrait was technically inaccurate. His disappointment concerned something the portrait had never claimed to convey: the intangible qualities that create or destroy attraction. He knew the rules of the game. He'd just hoped the rules wouldn't apply to him. Elizabeth I's reign from 1558 to 1603 gives us even more evidence of portrait skepticism, because so many foreign ambassadors were tasked with evaluating the Queen as a potential bride, and they wrote detailed dispatches comparing her appearance to her official portraits. This was their job: see through the image, report the reality. Diego Guzman de Silva, Spanish ambassador to Elizabeth's court from 1564 to 1568, reported to Philip II of Spain multiple times about the Queen's appearance. In a dispatch from October 1564, preserved in the Spanish state archives at Simancas, Silva described Elizabeth as appearing older and less radiant than her portraits suggested. He noted the painting showed una dama más joven y bella, a younger and more beautiful lady than the woman he observed at court. He did not frame this as fraud. He presented it as an observation about how royal portraits functioned. They showed idealized versions for official purposes. Everyone understood this. Silva's task was precisely to see through the official image to the reality beneath it, and his reports to Philip assumed the Spanish king would understand the difference between portrait propaganda and personal description. Elizabeth's official portraits weren't intelligence. They were advertisement. Silva's role was to supply what the portraits deliberately omitted. The existence of multiple, wildly different portraits of Elizabeth proves contemporaries understood portrait appearance as variable rather than fixed. Early portraits from the 1560s show a young woman with auburn hair and delicate features. Later portraits from the 1590s show an ageless icon with chalk-white skin, elaborate ruffs, symbolic accessories representing virginity and imperial power. The progression doesn't track biological aging. Elizabeth appeared more youthful in her later official portraits than in earlier ones. She aged backward in art, while aging forward in life. And everyone knew it. The portraits served political purposes. They projected an image of eternal monarchy, timeless authority. In 1563, Elizabeth's government drafted a proclamation, never formally enacted but preserved in the Cecil Papers at Hatfield House. expressing concern about poorly executed portraits that failed to capture the Queen's dignity. The proclamation proposed that only officially approved painters should produce the Queen's image, not because unauthorized portraits might be too honest, because they might be insufficiently flattering, because they might fail to project appropriate majesty. The concern was quality control of propaganda, not accuracy of representation. Everyone involved understood the Queen's official image was a constructed product. The worry was that unauthorized versions might construct it badly. By the 17th century, portrait conventions had become so thoroughly understood they served as material for public satire. And satire requires shared assumptions. Jokes only work if everyone already knows what you're mocking. Samuel Butler's mock epic poem Hudibras, published in 3 parts between 1663 and 1678, directly addresses portrait flattery. Butler describes a painted beauty whose portrait shows a face that nature never made, listing the conventional improvements: eyes enlarged, complexion smoothed, features regularized, and observing that anyone who'd seen the subject would recognize the portrait as a collaborative fiction between painter and patron. The joke only lands because Butler's readers already knew portraits work this way. It's like making jokes about Photoshop today. You don't have to explain that magazine covers are retouched. You don't have to tell audiences that Instagram models use filters. The knowledge is so widespread that the humor can build on top of it. Butler was doing exactly that 3 centuries earlier. The playwright Aphra Behn, writing in the 1670s and 1680s, created multiple comic scenes involving the discrepancy between portrait and person in marriage negotiations. Characters explicitly discuss their expectation that portraits will flatter and their need to verify claims through personal inspection. The comedy comes not from naive characters being deceived, but from sophisticated characters navigating a system everyone understands. Behn's audiences, courtiers, educated urbanites who attended London theatre, would have commissioned or sat for portraits themselves. They recognized the conventions from personal experience. The laughs came from recognition. Roger de Piel, the French critic, published his Cours des peintures par principe in 1708, with explicit discussion of how portrait painters should approach their subjects' imperfections. He distinguished between defects that should be corrected, temporary blemishes, unflattering lighting, and features that should be softened but preserved, distinctive characteristics that made subjects recognizable. The nose might be slightly straightened, the eyes marginally enlarged, the complexion unified, but the overall proportions should remain close enough to reality that viewers would recognize the subject. A portrait bearing no resemblance would fail even as flattery. This is exactly how we think about photo editing today. You smooth the skin, brighten the eyes, maybe slim the jawline, but you don't transform yourself into a completely different person. That would defeat the purpose. The goal is the best possible version of you, recognizably you, but optimized. De Piel's treatise was printed, sold, and read across educated Europe. Professional knowledge codified in plain sight. No secrets, no deception. So why do modern actresses look wrong in period costumes? Because we're not looking at period faces. We're looking at 21st century faces that have been shaped by entirely different forces. Start with the bones. Centuries of improved nutrition have fundamentally changed human bone structure. Medieval Europeans who survived childhood often had narrower faces, less pronounced cheekbones, different jaw development than modern populations. Chronic malnutrition affected how faces grew. Vitamin deficiencies shaped skulls differently. Childhood diseases left their marks on bone density and facial architecture. A modern actress has been fed a diet that would have seemed miraculous to a Renaissance noblewoman: protein, calcium, vitamins. Her bones developed differently because of it. Her face is literally built on a different foundation. Then there's orthodontics. Modern teeth are uncannily straight and uniform compared to historical teeth. This isn't vanity. It's the result of dental intervention that simply didn't exist before the 20th century. Braces, retainers, palate expanders, Invisalign. When an actress with perfectly aligned teeth smiles in a period drama, that smile reads as modern. The bones of her face have been shaped by orthodontic work over years of childhood and adolescence. The proportions are different because the underlying structure was literally moved into new positions. Historical teeth weren't crooked because people didn't care about appearance. They were crooked because there was no technology to straighten them. When you see a portrait with a closed mouth expression, you're partly seeing a convention, but you're also seeing practical reality. Dental presentation was not a strong suit of the pre-modern era. And then there's what's been called Instagram face. You know it when you see it. That particular look that emerged over the past 15 years. Pillowy lips achieved through filler injections. Contoured cheekbones that look sculpted even without makeup. Slightly cat-like eyes created by threads, or what's called the fox eye lift. Veneers that create unnaturally white, perfectly shaped teeth. Buccal fat removal that hollows the cheeks and eliminates the soft roundness of natural faces. These procedures have become so normalized that we sometimes don't consciously register them, but they create a very specific aesthetic, an aesthetic that clashes violently with historical beauty ideals. Consider what Renaissance painters were enhancing: softness, roundness, pale plumpness that suggested wealth and leisure, the moon-faced ideal, the gentle curves, the rounded cheeks that signaled a woman who never had to work, never missed a meal, never labored under the sun. Modern cosmetic procedures do the opposite. They remove fat. They create angles. They sharpen features that historical beauty standards would have softened. They produce faces that would have looked gaunt, hungry, even ill to a Renaissance viewer. When an actress who's had subtle cosmetic work puts on a period costume, the cognitive dissonance is immediate. Her face is sharp where it should be soft, hollow where it should be full, angular where it should be round. She's had her face sculpted toward a beauty ideal that didn't exist until the age of Instagram, and it shows. There's also the matter of expression. Modern actors train to perform for cameras, specifically for close-up cameras that capture micro-expressions. They learn to convey emotion through tiny movements of the eyes and mouth. They practice the kind of subtle acting that reads on a 50-foot screen. Their faces are trained to be mobile, expressive, constantly communicating. Historical portrait subjects sat for paintings over hours or days. They held still. They maintained composed expressions that projected dignity, serenity, authority. The internal performance was completely different. Stillness rather than expressiveness. When you put a modern actress trained for camera work into a period setting, she carries that training in her face. Her muscles are conditioned for different work. And we've all spent a lifetime being photographed in ways historical people never experienced. Selfies, video calls, front-facing cameras. We've developed what might be called camera awareness, an unconscious sense of how we're being perceived that shapes how we hold our faces even when we're not actively posing. We've seen ourselves from angles that were impossible before modern technology. We've adjusted accordingly. Historical people were photographed approximately never. That shows too. There's a painter who represents the absolute mastery of this system. A woman who so thoroughly understood flattering portraiture that she could make idealization appear natural, inevitable, almost accidental. Her name was Elisabeth Louise Vigée Lebrun. Born in Paris on April 16, 1755, started painting professionally as a teenager after her father, the pastel portraitist Louis Vigée, died in 1767. By 1778, she'd been summoned to Versailles to paint Marie Antoinette for the first time, beginning a professional relationship that would produce approximately 30 portraits of the Queen over the following decade. 30 portraits. Of the same woman. Think about what that means. Vigée Lebrun understood Marie Antoinette's face better than almost anyone alive. She knew exactly which angles worked, which lighting softened which features, which expressions conveyed warmth without sacrificing dignity. She had more data on that particular face than perhaps any artist has ever had on any subject. Her memoirs, published as Souvenirs between 1835 and 1837, are remarkably candid about her methods. She describes how she adjusted lighting to minimize shadows that might suggest aging, how she positioned subjects to emphasize their most graceful features, how she created the illusion of psychological depth, making her portraits seem to reveal their subjects' inner lives. She and Marie Antoinette actually discussed which aspects of the Queen's appearance to emphasize and which to soften. This was collaboration, not deception. Two sophisticated women constructing a visual narrative for political and personal purposes. The Queen knew she was being flattered. The painter knew the Queen knew. Viewers at court knew both of these things. But in 1783, Vigée Lebrun painted something that accidentally revealed how thin the line was between flattery and scandal. The painting showed Marie Antoinette in a gauze, a simple white muslin dress with a gauzy appearance that resembled the undergarments or informal wear that ladies wore in private. The portrait was submitted to the Salon of 1783, the major public art exhibition in Paris, where thousands of viewers would see it. The reaction was immediate and furious. Critics attacked the portrait for showing the Queen of France in what looked like a chemise, essentially underwear. The simplicity that Vigée Lebrun had intended as natural and refreshing was read as undignified, improper, even indecent. How dare anyone depict the Queen in such informal attire? The portrait suggested intimacy that the public had no right to see. The painting had to be removed from the exhibition. Vigée Lebrun quickly produced a replacement, showing Marie Antoinette in more appropriately regal attire. What makes this incident revealing is what it tells us about the sophistication of period viewers. They weren't just looking at portraits passively. They were reading them actively, analyzing choices, interpreting symbols, debating meanings. The Gaulle portrait scandal happened because viewers understood perfectly well that portraits communicated messages through clothing, setting, pose, and style. They could decode those messages, and when the message seemed inappropriate, they reacted. These were not naive people being fooled by pretty pictures. These were sophisticated visual readers who understood exactly what they were looking at. Vigée Lebrun's great innovation was making the flattery invisible. Other painters' idealizations look like idealizations. Hers look like truth. She had learned to hide the construction so thoroughly that viewers experienced her portraits as remarkably natural and lifelike, even though she was employing every technique in the book. The Gaulle incident shows the flip side of that skill. When she went too far toward the natural, audiences pushed back. They wanted flattery, but flattery that maintained appropriate dignity. They wanted idealization that stayed within acceptable bounds. They wanted the game played correctly. When the revolution came in 1789, Vigée Lebrun fled France on October 5th, the same day the mob marched on Versailles to force the royal family's return to Paris. She spent more than a decade painting the aristocrats and royals of Europe who had survived or escaped revolutionary upheaval. Italy, Austria, Germany, Russia. Everywhere she went, she found patrons who wanted what she offered: portraits that made them look beautiful while maintaining plausible deniability about the flattery involved. She returned to France in 1802. She lived until March 30th, 1842, dying at 86. Long enough to see Napoleon rise and fall. Long enough to see the Bourbon Restoration come and go. Long enough to see photography begin transforming how humans recorded appearances. Long enough to see the world she'd painted become history. Her memoirs offer the perspective of someone who'd practiced portrait flattery at the highest level for decades and could reflect on it without embarrassment. She understood what she'd done and saw no need to apologize. The portraits were never meant to be objective records. They were meant to be beautiful. They were meant to serve their subjects' needs, and everyone involved knew it. Her full story, the revolutionary escape, the years painting across Europe, the return to a transformed France, the reflections of an old woman on a vanished world, deserves its own deep dive. If you want to hear more about her, let me know in the comments. Here's what keeps coming back to me. That German prince in all those anecdotes, the one who supposedly looked at his bride's portrait and remarked that he understood how court painters worked. Maybe he existed. Maybe he didn't. The story survives in so many versions because it captures something true about how historical people actually engaged with visual representation. They weren't naive. They weren't fooled. They were doing exactly what you do when you swipe through dating profiles or scroll past carefully curated Instagram feeds. They understood the conventions. They knew the game. They evaluated accordingly. The portraits had enlarged eyes because painters knew big eyes read as sympathetic and youthful, triggering the same neotenic response that makes us find babies and puppies adorable. The foreheads were high because high foreheads signaled intelligence and nobility in the physiognomic thinking of the time. The complexions were smooth because smooth complexions suggested health and refinement. And everyone knew it. The question was never whether portraits were manipulated. Everyone knew they were. The question was whether anyone was actually fooled. The answer? Across centuries of evidence, from Henry VIII's disappointment to Diego Guzmán de Silva's diplomatic reports, to Samuel Butler's satire, to Roger de Piles's published treatises, to the scandal over Marie Antoinette's gall, is no. Historical people were just as media literate as you are. They just had different media. The actresses in period dramas look wrong because they carry the visual vocabulary of Instagram and iPhone cameras and a century of cinema. Their faces have been shaped by orthodontics, by nutrition that historical populations never enjoyed, by cosmetic procedures that create angles where history preferred curves. They've been photographed thousands of times. Their faces hold that knowledge. People in Renaissance portraits looked wrong to their contemporaries too, but wrong in the period-appropriate way. Wrong according to the conventions of their time. Wrong in ways that viewers understood and accepted. Every era has its filters. Every era has its beauty procedures. Every era has its visual conventions that seem natural to insiders and strange to outsiders. And every era, this is the part that matters, has people sophisticated enough to understand the difference between the image and the reality. Subscribe for more stories like this.